As St. John of the Cross says, God refuses to be known by the intellect. God only allows himself to be loved by the heart. Now the heart was that holistic image for when you're putting all of these different parts together. So when all of you is here, I'm going to call that prayer. Or at least you're capable of union. Union with yourself, and therefore union with God. And union with your brother and sister. But first of all, you've got to see how much your mind is keeping you from doing that. I'm going to give an example that I'm sure is not true in this very warm crowd. But I'll bet there might be one or two of you out there who are sitting there judging me. For all kinds of good reasons. Usually people think I'm going to be taller for some reason. I don't know. There's some disappointed at my bald head, you know. Maybe you don't like my throaty, cold voice. Maybe you don't like my American accent. Maybe you don't like what I'm saying. Or maybe you don't like the way I'm saying it. Or maybe you don't agree with me. But my point is, I want you to watch and observe that how you do anything is how you do everything. And if, I'm sure it isn't true, but if you've been sitting there for 20 minutes, judging me, critiquing me, analyzing me, trying to find out if I'm a liberal or a conservative, if I'm a heretic or orthodox or too Catholic or not Catholic enough, which is the way the dualistic mind works, all right? All I want to tell you, you can think whatever you want about me, because I'm going to be out of your life in a few minutes. But just know that how you think about me is how you do life. And probably you do your wife that way, and you do your children that way, and you do your neighbor that way. How you do it is how you do it. I'm going to repeat it. I know that sounds like I'm saying nothing. How you do it is how you do it. And once you see, how do I do life? How do I access the moment and take in my experience? Am I always judging it, dismissing it, trivializing it, making it of no importance? That's probably how your mind works. And that's what you have to see. Because you won't let go of it any other way. And that trivializing, petty, judging mind cannot get you there. Now that's why every spiritual teacher that I've ever read, a more mature spiritual teachers, like Jesus himself, will have this one-liner almost always in their teaching. Jesus, it's Matthew 7:1, it's other places too. Do not judge. Now I know what you smart people are thinking. You're all saying, well, come on, Father, now we have to make appropriate judgments. We're smart people, and there's good things and there's bad things. And no, that's not what they mean. That's not what they mean at all. What they mean is that when you approach the moment, your first response to the moment, to the event, to the person standing right in front of you, you first have to be free to say yes before you say no. That's what they mean by do not judge. The normal egotistical mind, the normal narcissistic, dualistic mind that we've all been trained in, you actually approach most moments starting with no. Why you don't like it, why you don't agree with her, why he's not dressed right, why he's not in your social class, why she isn't of the right religion. You know that's true. When you start with no, brothers and sisters, it's very hard to get back to yes. And frankly, you'll never love. You'll never be a loving person. You'll close down too quickly and too early. So, we learn to trust this mind, even though this mind is largely a control tower, a defense mechanism, and it's a judgment machine. Just makes one judgment after the next. And in great part, this doesn't mean there weren't saints in the last 400 years. This doesn't mean there weren't people who didn't love God. But for the most part, the contemplative tradition has not been solidly taught for 400 years. And all the experts are agreeing upon that. Let me give you just a simple little story that brings this home. I was able to give the retreat to the monks at Gethsemane. That's the monastery in Kentucky where Thomas Merton was a monk. And I had given them their retreat in 1985, and I thought I would impress them. It was a full 8-day retreat, and I wanted to show them how holy I was and how smart I was and how informed I was. And so the first 2 days I kept dropping Thomas Merton's name, presuming, of course, this worldwide luminary, this teacher who's been translated into all major languages, would certainly be appreciated there in his own monastery. And then I noticed that when I tend to mention, as Thomas Merton said, some would scowl, and some would sort of grimace or look away. So the second day I pulled one of the brothers aside, and I said, was Thomas Merton not popular here in his own community? Thinking perhaps it was that classic situation of the prophet not being honored in his own country. And he said, no, we didn't like him very much. And of course he's buried right outside, and people from all over the world come to visit his tomb. And I said, well, why would you not like Thomas Merton? And here is what he told me. He said, Thomas Merton told us we were not contemplatives. We were just introverts. You got it. And he was right. It was almost single-handedly that Thomas Merton pulled back the veil. And now the teachers have emerged in the last 40 years. He died 40 years ago this December when he was electrocuted in Bangkok. But in the subsequent 40 years, we have appreciated the veil he pulled back. Because he said the older contemplative tradition has not been taught for centuries now. He said most monks and nuns in contemplative communities say prayers all day. Or sometimes, unfortunately, antisocial people who don't like people that much, or who don't like to talk, or just like to be quiet. 5s on the Enneagram, perhaps, or introverted personality types. But that of itself can no longer be called holiness. That's why we named our center in New Mexico, I know some of you have been there, the Center for Action and Contemplation. And people ask me why I gave the center such a long and cumbersome title. And they say, which is more important, action or contemplation? And I say the most important word in our title is and. That's the art form. That's the absolute art form. Stephen's the director of our center, who's accompanying me, and he'll be available for questions afterwards. But we've been trying to practice it for 2 weeks, going into different cities, different rooms, different people. How do you keep your center? How do you keep in love? How do you keep in communion while meeting new people, new places? It's heroic. If you don't know your center, if you haven't found your center, if the divine indwelling is not a living experience, I would say there's no way to do it. You just lose your soul to every new crowd, or every new compliment, or every new confusion, whatever it is. I usually lose mine to the confusions. Let me tell you one more story about that retreat. As I said, it was an 8-day retreat. And after I finished, the abbot asked me, he said, Richard, how can we pay you for this retreat? And I said, well, I'm supposed to be a poor Franciscan, and I don't need any money, but I would love it if I could live for a month or so in Thomas Merton's hermitage. I said, I've studied him ever since I was young and admired him, and that would be a thrill. The other one was to visit Julian of Norwich's, which I just got to do today. But he said, sure, Richard, just come whenever you want, and it's yours. So when I came, he told me that out deep into the Kentucky woods, there were a few recluses. A recluse is more than just a hermit. The recluses only come in for Christmas midnight Mass and the Easter Vigil Mass. Their experience of communion is not Mass and liturgy, it's living in constant communion with God, just, I guess, as Julian did. And they said that when these monks appear at the door of the church on Christmas and Easter, everybody's waiting to see if they've gone crazy or they're glowing. And so one day I was walking in the woods and I saw one of these recluses coming toward me on the path. He was a former abbot, Father Flavian, a very holy man. And sure enough, he was glowing. Just had this beautiful, warm, gracious smile on his face. And he eagerly came toward me and he looked right at me. He said, "Richard." And of course, when he said Richard, I was shocked and frankly a little disappointed, because I thought he must not be a very good recluse if he knows who I am. He said, "Richard, you get to preach. You get to preach all over the world." And he said, "I don't. And so please, just tell the people one thing." And he pointed to the sky and he said, "Tell the people God is not out there. God bless you." And he bowed to me and went down the path. And I just obeyed his orders. I just told you what he told me to tell you. But unfortunately, the vast majority of Western Christians, Catholic and Protestant, still think of God as out there because they have not had any inner experience. And I think that's why it's so easy to throw out the baby with the bathwater. That's why it's so easy to remain dualistic in either-or thinking, because you haven't really experienced the mystery, which is always paradoxical, which is always a mixture of darkness and light. If you take, for example, the two great revelations in the Scriptures, Moses on Mount Tabor, or Mount Sinai, Jesus on Mount Tabor, notice in both cases, there's the apparition, there's the epiphany, there's the revelation of a presence, and then in both cases, immediately it's covered with clouds. Knowing is always balanced by unknowing. And unfortunately, we have given Western Christians a kind of lust for answers, a kind of insistence on certitude, on closure, on resolution. And so we have people who aren't very patient, who aren't very compassionate, who aren't very tolerant. In our country, I just use this as a gross example. It's always easier to pick on a country somewhere else. But the very fact that racism was not seen as a major or central gospel issue till the late 1960s is an absolute judgment on the immaturity of Western Christianity. That it was not for most people a transformational system, it was for most people a belonging system. My belonging system is better than your belonging system. And so what we fought about was the container, and we got so invested in the container that many of our people never got to the contents, never got to experience what it was all about. Everything was the forms, the forms, the forms. My forms are better than your forms. There's the Anglican form and the Roman form. And we'd waste time trying to prove that one was better than another, instead of teaching people how to go into the mystery. And that is always formless. It is always a mixture of darkness and light where I can't explain it with perfect certitude. It took Julian 20 years of sitting here in her cell in Norwich, England, to comprehend one night of religious experience. May 8th, 1373, it's supposed to have happened in this city. And she enclosed herself in that little spot for 20 years to try to unpackage what had happened to her. And if you read her showings, there's just this constant ability to deal with paradox and mystery and darkness. And she doesn't insist on certitude or answers. She can let God be God. I want to end this by giving you what I try to give to every country I go to, because I think it's the best thing I can give you. And even if you forget everything I've said in these 50 minutes, please remember this. Every year in late April in Santa Fe, that's the capital of our state, New Mexico, where Stephen and I live, there's an international conference on the convergence of science and religion. It's really, literally mind-blowing. And the amazing thing is that these PhDs, these scientists, seem to be much more able to deal with hypotheses and theory and mystery than most clergy that I know. For example, the one you've all heard. You know, some say that light is a wave, and some say that light is a particle, and they say, well, they're both true, you know, and we're not going to try to eliminate one. I wish the church could operate that way. Jesus certainly had no trouble. His parables, clearly do not allow for simply one interpretation. As a Franciscan, I'm aware that in the 13th century, Franciscans and Dominicans were the official Catholic debating society. We hardly ever agreed with the Dominicans on anything. We followed John Duns Scotus, one of yours. They followed Thomas Aquinas. And there was the Dominican opinion and the Franciscan opinion. And you know what? They didn't kick either of us out. I wish we could be that way today. But where I discover it now is ironically in the people who we thought were our enemies, scientists who we thought were so rational. At any rate, one of these scientists that I was listening to several years ago also happened to be a Jewish rabbi. And in his talk, he said, you know, you Christians never really understood the meaning of the third commandment, to not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. He said, for some reason, you thought that that meant you were not supposed to say, God damn you. Well, it isn't very nice to say, God damn you. But do you know that's not even close to the meaning of the commandment? Vanus is emptiness. To speak something in vain is to speak it with emptiness, with futility. It's a waste of time. He said the meaning of the commandment, as it was understood for centuries in Judaism, was don't even speak the name. Don't ever in your lifetime pronounce the sacred name Yahweh. Never. And he said this gave us, at the very beginnings of the Judeo-Christian tradition, a cosmic humility about God. That once you think you've got God in your pocket, that you understand the great mystery, religion always becomes, he said, arrogant and idolatrous, where we love our explanations of God more than actually falling in love with God, where God refuses to ever be an object of the intellect, but is only known by those who enter into love and surrender. Secondly, he said, and probably a lot of you know this, that when you write Hebrew, you actually just write the consonants. And what it means to be an educated Jew is to have memorized the appropriate vowels and to know how to fill in the appropriate vowels in the appropriate places. I knew that from my short Hebrew class. But the third part is what I most want to leave with you tonight. He said, did you know that the consonants used in the spelling of the sacred name, Yahweh, are in fact the only consonants that, if correctly pronounced, do not allow you to use your tongue or close your lips. In fact, we know that the pronouncing of the sacred name was an attempt to imitate and replicate breath. That it was inhalation and exhalation. And then he began to do it into the microphone. And in a few minutes, tears started being audible in the room, in a room of PhDs. I now give this to every crowd I can because it can change your life. It can change your life. If I would come back here a year from tonight, and if some of you hold on to this and begin to live it and to experience it and to practice it, your prayer life will dramatically change. But notice, it has nothing to do with thinking. In fact, it moves the entire experience to the cellular, body, corporeal breath level. And it means, wonder of wonders, that the first word you ever spoke when you came out of your mother's womb was the name of God. And the last word you'll ever speak, you don't have to try to remember, do I want to say a prayer before I die? You're going to anyway. That last breath you take on your deathbed will be the name of God. And it's the one thing you've done constantly. You just did it now. And you did it again. You're breathing. And you know what? There's not a Catholic way of breathing and an Anglican way of breathing. There's not a Protestant way of breathing. There's not an American way of breathing. There's not an English way of breathing. There's not a Buddhist way of breathing. There's not a Hindu way of breathing. There's not a Muslim way of breathing. We're all doing this together. And this wonderful God has made the God Self that available, that democratic, that accessible. The gift is given. The only problem is the gift is not being received. We've made religion into a series of moral achievement contests. We've made religion into a bunch of hoops that you got to jump and about a bunch of forms that you've got to bow down before, instead of leading people to know something to be true for themselves. And you can see why Jesus was so happy with his cousin John the Baptist, who was filling in the valleys and bringing the mountaintops down and creating a highway to God. But we've created endless obstacles on this highway of the givenness of God, the availability of God, the humility of God, the compassion of God. But I don't want you to leave here tonight agreeing with me or disagreeing with me, liking me or disliking me. Who cares? It doesn't matter. It really doesn't. I want you to know something for yourself. So, for 10 minutes, we're going to sit in silence together. The most innocent thing in the world, and yet for many people, the most difficult thing in the world. It's so easy that it's hard to teach. Now, contemplation, second stage, is telling you what to do with your mind. And all I can say, because we don't have that much time tonight, is you just have to practice letting go. Letting go. Not identifying with it, not feeding it. Inside of every person, there's a great lover and there's a great wolf. And the one that grows is the one that you feed. If you keep feeding the wolf with negative, blaming, accusing, paranoid, accusational thoughts, your wolf will grow. If you keep feeding the lover by letting go of the wolf, largely because the lover is already there, it's called the indwelling Holy Spirit that has been given equally to all of you. And the only difference is the degree you have learned to draw from it. That's all. And that's what we're doing. So we're going to practice for about 10 minutes, just letting go of obsessive thoughts, compulsive emotions, and each time one comes and wants to grab you, just say, don't need that, don't need that. Knew who I was before that came along. I can know who I am after. It's going to be scary because a lot of us think we are our thoughts. So let me lead you into it with a psalm verse. And I'm going to ask you to repeat after me. And then we'll sit for 10 minutes knowing that someone else is going to teach us and guide us during that time. So repeat after me. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Slowly come out of the silence without losing the silence. Some have said silence is the language of God, and everything else is a poor translation. And some of you might be thinking, watch that thinking, that, well, this isn't prayer, is it? Let me put it this way, that if God wants to get through to you, God has a much better chance of doing it at that point. Because finally, you are out of the way with your agenda and your conclusions and your judgments. And when you're out of the way, God can do God's work. We can't convert ourselves, brothers and sisters. All we can really do is keep out of the way. Let me end this with a poem, and then we'll open up to just a few questions. Although you don't need answers now, so I can't promise you answers. This is from an American woman poet that I use very often. Her name is Mary Oliver. She lives in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and certainly has taught me and many others how to see. She's a marvelous seer, which must be the very definition of a good poet. This particular one is called Mindful. Every day, I see or hear something that more or less kills me with delight, that leaves me like a needle in the haystack of light. It was what I was born for, to look, to listen, to lose myself inside this soft world, to instruct myself over and over again in joy and acclamation. And I am not talking about the exceptional, the fearful, the dreadful, the very extravagant. I'm talking of the ordinary, the common, the drab, the daily presentations, the now, I might add. O good scholar, I say to myself, how can you help but grow wise with such teachings as these? The untrimmable light of the world, the ocean shine, the prayers that are made out of the grass. If you can learn a contemplative way of seeing the world, you'll still say prayers, and that's good, but you'll more become a prayer. And it's not what you'll see, it's how you'll see everything. And that changes everything. I'm going to be so presumptuous as to say, maybe arrogant, but I don't think so. What I've tried in my own feeble words to talk about tonight, I think is the pearl of great price. Because God is given, the only problem is on our side. We haven't been given the eyes to see. And you can't see what you aren't told to look for. When you think it's only in church services or moralities or rituals, when 99% of life is the drab, the ordinary presentations. And when you can see God everywhere, of course, you'll see that God, first of all, within yourself, and then you'll see out there what you've graciously discovered within yourself.